Well, we've been talking about the end of the underground comics movement, the underground comics era, which, of the course, 1975-76 had several last gasps, but this is the last gasp. The title Arcade, the Comics Review, that was created and edited by Art Spiegelman, which lasted 7 quarterly issues from spring of 1975 to the final issue in the fall of 1976. And over the course of those 7 issues, there were several artists who contributed stories, from Robert Crumb and Justin Green, Gilbert Shelton to Spain, Aline Kaminsky, and many others. With the cancellation of Arcade, the Comics Review, that was the end, the official end of the underground comics movement. Although there's going to be a couple of sort of rebirths of a sort, but neither of those are part of the famous or infamous underground movement of the 70s. Now, in the very final issue of Arcade, which was the very final underground comic, really, things kind of came full circle, because there was a feature, Arcade Archives, Sex Comics of the 30s, about Tijuana Bibles, with an introduction written by Art Spiegelman himself, that reprinted in full 5 of those Tijuana Bibles, including one about a famous comedy duo, Laurel and Hardy. Now, these 2 panels are the only 2 panels out of the 5 pages that I felt like I could actually show. All right, well, let's talk about this guy from Cleveland, the Poet Laureate of Cleveland, as he has been unofficially called, Harvey Pekar, although I have met people from Cleveland who insist it's pronounced Pekar. Harvey P., who was a file clerk in a Cleveland hospital and got involved in the underground comics movement when he was befriended by Robert Crumb, and his first story was published by Robert Crumb, I think illustrated by Robert Crumb. Harvey Pekar was not an artist. He was a writer, and various different artists illustrated his work. Now, 1976, just as the underground comics movement is dying, Harvey Pekar made a transition to a regular comic that would run for a long time, called American Splendor, that was essentially an ongoing memoir or autobiography of Harvey Pekar. And he produced 1 new issue per year for over 30 years. And initially this was an underground comic for, all intents and purposes. It fit all the definitions. He printed it himself and distributed it himself to begin with, but eventually it was picked up by Fantagraphic Books Publishing, and thereby became sort of the transition between the end of the underground comics movement and the beginning of the independent comics movement that we'll be talking about in great detail later. Now, in 1986, Fantagraphic Books collected the first 9 issues of American Splendor into 1 volume, making it a graphic novel, and released it to great critical acclaim, which made Harvey Pekar a national celebrity, and he went on the David Letterman show and was a regular guest, and a very entertaining guest, on David Letterman for many years. In 2003, there was a very good movie made about his life called American Splendor, starring Paul Giamatti. All right. Well, I said that there were a couple of revivals of the underground scene. The big one was happening just as the San Francisco hippie underground comic scene was dying, the mid 1970s, and it was the punk scene. Just as hippies were transitioning to punk, well, some were. Uh, Young musicians were moving toward punk, and definitely away from disco, which was also a thing that was happening at the time. One good example of this that most people don't think about is the band Blondie, with Debbie Harry with lead vocals, that in the early 70s was very much a San Francisco hippie flower power kind of vibe, that by the mid 70s was hardcore punk. And the hardcore punk had its own underground comics scene, starting with the magazine Punk, the fanzine, which was run by John Holmstrom, an artist in his own right, and focused on, punk icons of the time, including Iggy Pop, who you see here, and the Ramones. And Holmstrom actually designed and illustrated a couple of the Ramones album covers in the 1970s. The punk, the comic, also was a heavy promoter of the iconic punk nightclub from the 70s, CBGB. On the opposite end of the country, on the other coast, out in L.A., there was a punk underground comic called Slash, and it was in the pages of Slash that Gary Panter first appeared. His work first appeared, including his character Jimbo that you can see there. That appeared frequently in Slash, starting in 1977 for the next few years, after which he transitioned to doing album covers, but still also participating in the independent comics movement, as we'll see. Gary Panter got into the comics scene with his roommate at the time and best friend, Matt Groening, whom we've mentioned briefly once before. Matt Groening, also a cartoonist, who had a comic strip called Life in Hell that was picked up by newspapers and ran for many years, although he's most famous not for Life in Hell, but for what came 9 years later, The Simpsons. Now, if you'll recall, the time before when we mentioned Matt Groening was in relationship to Linda Berry. Linda Berry comes on the scene around this time. We talked about her when we were talking about important women comics artists and writers. Remember, she had gone to Evergreen State College. She was classmates with Matt Groening, and he and another of her classmates that was editing the paper, the university paper, printed up some of her comics that she was kind of doing, kind of like for therapy, and actually got them placed in some major newspapers. And then she was on her way with several significant graphic works in the ensuing years, and eventually induction in 2016 into the Eisner Hall of Fame. So here's just one brief sample of one of her panels from 1984. All right, well, in 1980, there was an independent magazine that was created and edited by Art Spiegelman, right? Same guy who had created and edited the previous Arcade, the thing that ended the underground comics movement. This was part of the independent movement. The difference between underground comics and independent comics, basically what it comes down to is that they're not homemade, They do have production values, and they are distributed beyond just by hand, right? So they do get placed in places where magazines are sold. Maybe not a lot of them, and maybe not in a lot of places, but more than just in the town where they're made. Raw ran for 11 years and was the venue in which Art Spiegelman serialized his ongoing work, Mouse. Basically, a chapter per issue. And the issues didn't come out real often. And then, after the whole thing was finished in 1991, then the whole thing was then collected in bound volume form. That's when he won the Pulitzer Prize. Other people who contributed to Raw included Gary Panter, that we just mentioned, Chris Ware, and we'll talk more about him later when we discuss graphic novels, and Charles Burns. There's a self-portrait of the artist Charles Burns and his most famous work, Black Hole, which was serialized over 12 issues and was kind of a horror story about a sexually transmitted disease that causes horrible mutation to teenagers. And really, it's more than just a scary story. It's kind of a parable, kind of a cautionary tale, making a lot of statements about 20th century culture. He got his start in Raw. That's where he came to prominence in the early 80s. I think he appeared in the first issue, maybe the second issue. But his stories in Raw were kind of existential, a little bit surreal, but were also kind of like horror stories in the EC tradition about things like zombies, which is what this one is about. All right, well, the punk movement that was ongoing on both the East Coast and the West Coast in the 80s produced Raymond Pettibone, who was really punk. He was a punk cartoonist and a punk musician. He was, for a while, the bass player for his brother's band, Black Flag, which I hope you've heard of Black Flag. If you haven't, you need to bone up on Black Flag. You need to pettibone up on Black Flag, which was the most prominent, probably the most important punk band, 1980s West Coast punk band, the LA punk scene. That from them, sort of this circle of different bands developed. That they were a part of a network there on the West Coast, traveling around, staying in different people's homes, sometimes sleeping in cars, and performing concerts at people's houses, and growing into a second wave of the punk movement. And Raymond Pettibone designed their logo, their famous, very simplistic logo, their flyers, their album covers, and so forth. Here's an album cover he did for Sonic Youth in 1990. Black Flag was very influential to a lot of artists, particularly in the late 80s in the Pacific Northwest, including a guy named Kurt Cobain, who put together a band called Nirvana in 1988. And this is their first show poster that has artwork by Kurt Cobain that very clearly, just like with their music, shows the strong influence of Black Flag and Raymond Pettibone. Now, I said there were a couple of revivals. I kind of feel like in recent years there has been another mini punk underground comics revival, most particularly as demonstrated in this this title that's been put out since 2013 is an anthology title of punk underground comics with a punk sensibility and frequently with punk rock themes, called As You Were. So let's shift our attention back to what's going on, quote unquote, above ground in comics in the mid 70s, right? We've basically covered up through the early 70s. So let's take a look at what's going on there. First, we're going to take a look at Charlton Comics, because they introduced a significant superhero character. Wow, a significant superhero character from Charlton. And not surprisingly, no one noticed. And the book was canceled after 10 issues. It was called E-Men, the very first environmental superhero. Now, the book was canceled, like I said. In the early 80s, though, just before DC bought all the Charlton superheroes, First Comics made a bid to just specifically buy E-Man, and they did, and so they were able to have their own E-Man comics in the early 80s, and it was successful. It's kind of a cult favorite. It was a lot more light-hearted and ironic approach to the character. So, E-Man, environmental superhero. Of course, the big two were Marvel and DC, which for the longest time, DC, well, the big two had been Dell and DC, and Marvel was an also ran. Finally, remember how Marvel was inching up in sales, kind of slowly, throughout the late 1960s, to the extent that it had DC worried. Finally, the tipping point came, and it was kind of pushed along by Martin Goodman, who at this point, we're talking 1972, was still publisher at Marvel Comics. He had sold it to Perfect Film and Chemical in 1968, but had kept the job as publisher. And Marvel and DC were using the same printing service, the same printers, and they were both informed the price of paper and ink had gone up, and so it's going to cost more to make the comics. Now, comics had changed after being 10 cents for decades. They'd gone up to 12 cents around 1960 or so, and then by the end of the 60s, they had gone up to 15 cents. And now they're going to have to be raised. They'd gone up to 20 cents in the early 70s, and now they're going to have to be raised again. So legend has it, I don't think that there's conclusive proof, but there's a whole lot of circumstantial evidence. Legend has it that Martin Goodman, publisher of Marvel Comics, got together with Carmine Infantino, who by that time was the publisher of DC Comics, and they agreed to both raise their prices at the same time, right? Kind of a mutual thing, so that neither side would gain an undue advantage over the other. And so they were both going to raise their prices to 25 cents. And they did that. They raised their prices to 25 cents, 1972, and expanded to more pages. But then the following month, Goodman took his back down to 20 cents, whereas DC, still had theirs at 25. And then this sudden move occurred where their competitor, Marvel, is now cheaper than they are. And in addition to that, Goodman had also made a deal with his distributors, raising their percentage, giving them a higher percentage profit on each Marvel book that was sold. So these same distributors were distributing DC books, right? So Marvel is cheaper. The people who deliver the comics and place them on the racks are getting a higher percentage from Marvel, so they'll make more profit the more Marvel books sell. And those two things combined led to a disaster for DC Comics. Their sales plummeted because, you could go out there, you could buy 5 Marvel comics for the cost of 4 DC comics. And like I said, that was the tipping point. Marvel actually made more money for the first time in comic book sales than DC. And that was going to continue to be the case for a couple of decades at least. DC quickly caught on and lowered their price back down to 20 cents, but it's too late. They had been at 25 for 3 or 4 months, whereas Marvel was only at 25 for 1 month. And so the damage had been done. Now, we talked earlier about Stan Lee and the fact that by 1972 he was feeling dissatisfied and was thinking about following the example of Jack Kirby and going over to the other side, to DC Comics. Part of the reason was that Martin Goodman had long been pushing his own son, Charles Chip Goodman, a young fella, as his heir apparent, as publisher, and therefore Stan Lee's boss. Right? And Stan Lee had been there for, by this point, over 30 years. Well, Stan Lee took a meeting with DC Comics, and they offered him the opportunity to come over to DC and become their editor-in-chief. Now, the owner of Marvel that Goodman had sold them to in 1968, Perfect Film and Chemical, this is around the time they changed it over to Cadence Industries. They were not too keen on losing Stan Lee. So they were sort of pressuring Martin Goodman to retire. And so he agreed to retire with the understanding that his son Chip would be taking over his job as publisher. And as soon as he retired, Cadence got rid of Chip Goodman too, because they wanted to give that position to Stan Lee, make him publisher, not just editor-in-chief. And so that's how all that came to be. And Martin Goodman, a little bit ticked off about that. And the following year, he started another comic company, a publishing company called Seaboard, with a comics division that he named, because he's really creative, Atlas, which is, of course, what his own books had been called in the 1950s. Atlas Comics. And to be editor-in-chief, he brought over Stan Lee's brother, Larry Lieber. And then there was another person that he brought over to initially be in charge as editor-in-chief of the comics, which there were 25 or 30 comics titles, and then also black and white magazines. So what he initially did, what Martin Goodman did, was he had Larry Lieber, whose only experience was in 4-color comics, take over the black and white magazines, and then the other guy who had worked in black and white magazines, take over the comics, and neither of them did very well. So Lieber was eventually promoted to be in charge of the comics as well. So 25 to 30 titles, pretty rapidly. And they actually, they got some promising new talent, and they got some old talent. Neil Adams did some work for them. So did several others, because they were offering a higher page rate than Marvel or DC. They were paying more per page. And they were offering creator rights, to retain some rights to the character, which of course Marvel and DC did not do. And that attracted the talent. The problem was, it didn't attract readers. Probably their biggest success was the sword and sorcery thing that we looked at earlier, Wolf, W-U-L-F. That was their biggest success. It lasted 4 whole issues. Many of the others only lasted 1 or 2, and within a year, the whole thing had tanked. and had gone out of business. Well, now let's look at some individuals who were coming to prominence in the 1970s. And we're going to start with these two guys, Len Wein and Marv Wolfman. Two guys who had known each other since they were in high school. Two guys from New York City, and yes, they're both Jewish. And they had been fans when they were teenagers. They used to come to DC Comics once a month to take the tour that was given, and they got involved in fanzines, and even creating fanzines when they were still in their teens. In fact, Marv Wolfman's fanzine was publishing work in 1965 from another young guy named Stephen King from up in Maine. Anyway, both of them got hired on as writers at DC Comics in the late 60s, around 1968. And they started off, as kind of pinch hitters, but they both quickly made their talents recognizable. Len Wein co-created The Swamp Thing in 1972. But shortly after that, both of them wound up going to from DC to Marvel. Now, they were freelancers, and they were doing a little bit of work for both, but mostly DC. Then they went over to doing mostly Marvel. And the two of them were sort of proteges of Roy Thomas, who by this time, had replaced Stan Lee as editor-in-chief. And in fact, after Roy Thomas quit as editor-in-chief, he was more of a writer. He only lasted for a couple of years with the grind of actually overseeing everything. Len Wein replaced him as editor-in-chief, and he lasted about a year. Quit under circumstances that we will discuss in a little bit. And then he was replaced by Marv Wolfman as editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, and he also only lasted for about a year. But both of them, much more well-known as writers. Both of them also were editors for a long time at Marvel, and then later at DC. At Marvel, Marv Wolfman, this is where we've mentioned him before, when the floodgates of horror comics opened back up, he and artist Gene Colan were the guys in charge of Tomb of Dracula, which was extremely popular and which introduced the character Blade. Len Wein was the editor of the X-Men, which had gone into reprints because the sales were so low. And remember, we talked earlier about the new X-Men, and I'd attributed that to Chris Claremont, but I was in error. Actually, editor Len Wein wrote the very first issue, the first appearance, Giant Size X-Men, of the new X-Men, and Claremont took over as scripter thereafter. Len Wein also, by that time, had already co-created Wolverine. So these guys, their names just kind of weave in and out of both Marvel and DC history, beginning in the early 1970s and for the rest of that century. Next, we'll look at Jim Starlin. We've already talked about him briefly. He was the co-creator in the 1970s of Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu. But he's best known for his run on Captain Marvel, which was something that garnered a lot of, maybe not a lot of sales, but a lot of critical acclaim. His cosmic approach and his large cast of characters in space, including Drax the Destroyer, who's the green guy that shows up on both of those covers, and the villain Thanos. So Jim Starlin still active in comics today. Steve Gerber, Talked about him just a few minutes ago when I was discussing Howard the Duck, and when I said that Steve Gerber was not your typical comic book scripter. He had, even in his superhero stuff, a touch of the surreal, and you can't really get more surreal than a talking duck. But over in Defenders, which he wrote for quite a while, over in Defenders, he had this subplot that went on for issue after issue after issue. There's this mysterious subplot where no matter what the heroes are doing, Doctor Strange and whoever he's recruited this month, there's this weird psychopathic elf who just keeps showing up randomly at people's houses, not main characters, not even anyone that we know, just random people, and murdering them. And we don't know why. And we keep thinking, as readers, we're going to find out why. But we never do. Maybe it was because Gerber wound up being taken off the title. But I don't know if he was ever going to do anything with this other than have just this weird stuff happening. Another thing, a character that Gerber created over in originally, actually two characters. The Aquarian, Wondar the Aquarian, that's him on the left. How much more hippie can you get than the Aquarian? This Jesus-looking guy who kind of wandered around the desert using his mysterious powers for mysterious things that I never quite understood. And then he also created the hippie character, or did Steve Gerber create it? I don't know. But looking at Wondar, I am reminded of Angar the Screamer, who was introduced in the pages of Daredevil, who was this hippie guy that was kind of cranky and had this power similar to the Black Canary over at DC, where, his voice could create sonic waves. And yes, of course, Angar the Screamer was in fact created by Steve Gerber. How could he not be? All right, now let's take a look at Steve Englehart. We've mentioned him before. It was Steve Englehart and Jim Starlin who co-created Shang-Chi. In the 1970s, he was known for his work on Doctor Strange. That got really strange in parts. And for his long run replacing Roy Thomas as scripter of The Avengers. But the storyline that he is best known for was the storyline over in Captain America and the Falcon, where the first phase of the story, which had involved this secret society, this Ku Klux Klan-like organization that was trying to take over the country, and Captain America finally catches the leader of this group and unmasks him, and it's the President of the United States who commits suicide rather than be arrested. Now, bear in mind, this is coming out at the same time that Watergate is going on, and there's a lot of disillusionment, general disillusionment with the government and with the country. There had already been that for years due to Vietnam, and this really just capped it off. Capped it off. I didn't even mean to do that. So anyway, in this storyline, Captain America is so disillusioned and disgusted with the U.S. government that he quits. He no longer wants to wear the uniform and carry the shield of Captain America, because what has America become? And instead, he adopts a new superhero identity, Nomad. Nomad, man without a country. And that lasts for a few issues. There's kind of an echo of that in the Marvel Cinematic Universe after Steve Rogers leaves his identity as Captain America, and grows a beard and has like a different outfit. Anyway, anyway, after 5 issues as Nomad, Steve Rogers reassumes the mantle of Captain America, realizing that he can be a symbol of America without being subservient to the United States government. Now, this kind of storyline for a character named Captain America from one of the major comics publishers would have been unheard of in the 1940s, 50s, even the 1960s. But in the mid-70s, it made perfect sense. By the way, a few years later, 1983, there was a new Nomad, a character named Jack Monroe, who had once briefly been Bucky after the original Bucky had died. And then in the 90s, he got a makeover and got his own book for a while, until in 2005 he was murdered by an assassin named the Winter Soldier, who we then find out is actually the original Bucky who died but didn't die. He was just brainwashed by Russians. And by the way, there's a female version of Bucky named Ricky Barnes from an alternate reality who is now on our Earth and known as Nomad. That's simple enough.